On July 30th, 2026, tens of thousands of people surged across a border fence in North Africa. Within 24 hours, Spanish officials put the number at nearly 50,000. Local estimates ran as high as 60,000. The death toll was reported at 18 within the first day. By the following afternoon, some outlets were reporting the toll had risen into the 30s and eventually passed 50. This did not happen on the border between two rival nations at war. It happened on the border of the European Union itself, on Spanish soil, in Africa. The place is called Ceuta. Most people outside Spain have never heard of it. But Ceuta sits on one of the most strategically important pieces of land on Earth. To understand why thousands of people risked their lives to reach it this week, we have to go back 600 years. We have to understand what Ceuta actually is, why Spain still owns a city in Africa, why a Spanish general once launched a civil war from its barracks, and why this crisis keeps repeating itself. This is the story of an outpost that has outlived empires, and the fault line it still sits on today. Ceuta is not a colony. It is not a military base leased from a foreign government. It is a Spanish city, constitutionally part of Spain, with a special status of an autonomous city, granted in 1995. Geographically, it sits on a small peninsula on the northern tip of Africa. Across the water, just 14 kilometers away, is mainland Spain, separated by the Strait of Gibraltar. On land, Ceuta is surrounded entirely by one country, Morocco. Roughly 85,000 people live there. Its economy runs on a duty-free port, trade with Morocco, and a heavy military and police presence. It is in effect a European city with African borders, a small fragment of the EU physically attached to the African continent. Ceuta's population is religiously and culturally mixed, with a sizable Muslim minority of Moroccan origin alongside its Catholic, Spanish origin majority, a mix that shapes local politics. Spanish is the only official language, but Darija, the Moroccan Arabic dialect, is widely spoken in daily life across parts of the city. Beyond its port, Ceuta's economy depends heavily on cross-border commerce with Morocco, on tourism from mainland Spain, and on a large public sector tied to its status as a garrison city. Spain maintains a significant military presence there, army, navy, and Guardia Civil units, reflecting its role as both a civilian city and a forward defensive position. Ceuta is not alone in this. History is full of small territories stranded on the wrong side of a border: Kaliningrad, Hong Kong, Gibraltar itself. But almost none of them sit at a choke point this important, on a continental fault line this old, or in a migration corridor this active. And that combination, geography, history, and migration, is what makes Ceuta one of the most sensitive pieces of territory in the world. To understand why European power wanted this particular strip of African coast, you have to understand what Ceuta was before any European ever arrived. For centuries, Ceuta was a wealthy Islamic port city, a keynote in trans-Saharan trade routes that carried gold, salt, and slaves across the desert to the Mediterranean world. Merchants there had access to West African gold, funneled north through caravan routes that had operated for hundreds of years. Ceuta at the time was under the rule of the Marinid dynasty, based in Fez, one of the major powers of the Western Islamic world, controlling much of present-day Morocco. By the early 1400s, Portugal was a small kingdom on the edge of Europe, hungry for a way into that gold trade, and increasingly obsessed with striking a blow against Islamic power in the Western Mediterranean. Portuguese chroniclers described Ceuta's markets as overflowing with spices, textiles, and gold, feeding a European imagination that saw North Africa as a source of almost limitless wealth. Portuguese chroniclers framed the coming attack as a continuation of the Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian campaign to reclaim Iberian territory from Muslim rule. But historians today see a second, more practical motive. Control of Ceuta meant control of a major artery of African gold, and a foothold from which to project power beyond Europe for the first time. That combination of religious justification and economic ambition would define European expansion for the next 400 years. Ceuta was where it began. The story does not start with Spain. It starts with Portugal. In 1415, a Portuguese fleet led by King John I with his sons aboard, captured Ceuta from its ruling Marinid dynasty in a single brutal day of fighting. It was one of the first European overseas conquests. Decades before Columbus ever crossed the Atlantic, and decades before Vasco da Gama reached India. Historians consider it a symbolic starting point for the Age of Discovery, the moment a European kingdom looked outward and decided to hold ground beyond its own continent. One of the young princes who fought at Ceuta was Henry, later known to history as Henry the Navigator. Some historians argue that Henry's experience at Ceuta, seeing the gold and goods flowing through its markets, helped inspire the decades of Portuguese voyages down the African coast that followed. For over 150 years, Ceuta remained a Portuguese outpost, a foothold on the African coast, garrisoned and expensive to maintain, but a matter of royal prestige. Portugal never managed to expand much beyond Ceuta's walls into the surrounding countryside. The city was, in practice, an isolated fortress, resupplied almost entirely by sea rather than by controlling its African hinterland. That pattern, a fortified coastal enclave cut off from the territory around it, dependent on ships rather than roads, would define Ceuta's relationship with Africa for the next 6 centuries. Then, in 1580, everything changed. The Portuguese king, Sebastian, had died young and childless 8 years earlier, and the crown passed through a series of weak claims before collapsing entirely. The Spanish king, Philip II, claimed the Portuguese throne through his family bloodline, and after a brief war, made his claim stick. For 60 years, from 1580 to 1640, Spain and Portugal were united under a single crown while remaining formally separate kingdoms with their own laws and institutions. Historians call this period the Iberian Union. During this time, Ceuta was administered as part of a unified Iberian Empire, its garrison and trade folded into a single Spanish-Portuguese system, stretching from Brazil to the Philippines. In 1640, Portuguese nobles revolted against Spanish rule, restoring an independent Portuguese monarchy under the House of Braganza. Almost all Portuguese colonies and territories, from Brazil to Portuguese India, eventually returned to Portuguese allegiance. Almost all, except Ceuta. Ceuta's population had different loyalties than the rest of the Portuguese Empire. Its merchants, its clergy, and its trade networks were tied more closely to Spain than to Lisbon by 1640. Part of this was economic. Ceuta's trade had reoriented towards Spanish Andalusia during the 60 years of Union, not toward distant Lisbon. Part of it was religious and institutional. Ceuta's bishop and much of its administrative class had been appointed through Spanish channels and saw their future tied to Madrid. When Portugal called on Ceuta to rejoin the restored kingdom, the city's governor and council refused, formally declaring loyalty to the Spanish crown instead. This was not settled quietly. It took decades of diplomatic friction, occasional naval skirmishes, and outright war between Spain and Portugal to resolve. The two kingdoms fought on and off for nearly 30 years after the split, in what is now known as the Portuguese Restoration War, with Ceuta's status remaining one loose thread in a much larger conflict. For Ceuta's residents, the choice was not purely sentimental. Staying Spanish meant staying connected to Spain's still vast global empire, including its American silver and its Mediterranean trade networks. Rejoining a smaller, newly independent Portugal, still finding its footing after 60 years of union, looked to many in Ceuta like the riskier bet. Finally, 1668, exhausted by decades of war, Portugal and Spain signed the Treaty of Lisbon, formally ending hostilities between the two kingdoms. In that treaty, Portugal formally recognized Spanish sovereignty over Ceuta, in exchange for Spain recognizing full Portuguese independence. A city conquered by Portuguese soldiers in 1415 became permanently Spanish by treaty in 1668, traded away in effect as the price of peace. That decision, made over 350 years ago, is still the legal foundation for Spain's claim today. It is worth pausing on that. Most European borders have shifted many times since 1668, through wars, revolutions, Napoleon's invasions, and the collapse of empires across 2 centuries. Ceuta's status has not changed once in 3.5 centuries. It may be one of the longest unbroken sovereignty claims in the modern world. For comparison, The borders of France, Germany, Italy, and Poland have all been redrawn multiple times since 1668. Ceuta's line on the map has simply never moved. Ceuta is not Spain's only foothold in North Africa. There's a second city, Melilla, about 400 kilometers to the east along the same coastline. Melilla's history has nothing to do with Portugal. In 1497, 5 years after the fall of Granada, ended nearly 8 centuries of Muslim rule in Spain. Spanish forces under the Duke of Medina Sidonia captured Melilla directly. It was part of the same expansionist wave that same decade, sent Spanish ships across the Atlantic under Columbus's flag. Where Ceuta's rulers largely fled or were absorbed, Melilla's conquest displaced its existing population almost entirely, and the city was rebuilt as a Spanish garrison town from the ground up. While Ceuta came to Spain through royal inheritance and a peace treaty, Melilla came through direct military conquest at the height of Spain's Reconquista momentum. Unlike Ceuta, which had briefly been Portuguese, Melilla has been continuously Spanish since the moment of its conquest in 1497, with no interruption or foreign administration at any point. Its position, further east along the coast and closer to the Rif Mountains, would later place it at the center of a very different and far bloodier chapter of Spanish colonial history. 2 cities, 2 different paths, but the same outcome. Permanent Spanish territory on African soil, held for more than 5 centuries. Melilla's story includes one of the most catastrophic events in modern Spanish military history. A disaster so severe it helped topple a government, and eventually, a monarchy. By 1921, Spain was trying to consolidate control over its protectorate in northern Morocco, an area it never fully pacified, including fiercely independent Berber tribes in the Rif Mountains. General Manuel Fernández Silvestre pushed Spanish forces deep into Rif territory from Melilla, overextending his supply lines in pursuit of a fast, prestige-driven conquest. He faced a formidable opponent, Abd el-Krim, a Rif leader who unified local tribes into a disciplined guerrilla army, partly armed with weapons captured from Spain itself. In July 1921, Abd el-Krim's forces attacked the overextended Spanish position at Annual, north of Melilla. What followed was a rout. Spanish forces collapsed in panic, abandoning weapons, equipment, and entire garrisons as they fled back toward Melilla. Estimates of Spanish dead range from roughly 8,000 to over 13,000 soldiers, killed within days, one of the worst defeats any European colonial power suffered in the 20th century. Melilla itself came close to falling. Only reinforcements and Abd el-Krim's decision not to press the assault kept the city in Spanish hands. The disaster triggered a political earthquake back home. A parliamentary investigation threatened to expose command failures, reaching into the royal palace itself. In 1923, before that investigation could conclude, General Miguel Primo de Rivera seized power in a coup, partly justified by the need to finally resolve the Moroccan crisis. Primo de Rivera's dictatorship eventually crushed Abd el-Krim's forces in 1926, with French military help, ending the short-lived republic of the If that Abd el-Krim had declared. But the political damage from Annual never fully healed. It discredited the monarchy and fed public anger at colonial wars, helping set the stage for the fall of the monarchy in 1931. It also forged the very army that Franco would lead into Spain 15 years later. A generation of officers hardened into a brutal, battle-tested colonial elite in the Rif Mountains. That officer corps carried the tactics and the ruthlessness of a decade-long colonial counterinsurgency directly into the Spanish Civil War that followed. Ceuta and Melilla are famous, but Spain holds smaller, almost forgotten territories along the Moroccan coast too. These are called the Plazas de Soberanía, the places of sovereignty. The Peñón de Velez de la Gomara is a tiny rock, connected to the mainland by a narrow shifting sandbar held by Spain since 1564. It once housed a small garrison. Today it has no permanent civilian residence at all, only rotating Spanish military personnel. The Peñón de Alusama is another fortified islet just off the Moroccan coast, under Spanish control since 1673, seized during ongoing conflicts with local Rif rulers. The Chafarinas Islands near Melilla were annexed by Spain in 1848, specifically to stop France, then expanding aggressively across North Africa, from taking them first. And then there is Isla Perejil, Parsley Island, uninhabited, barely more than a rock just off the Moroccan coast near Ceuta. In July 2002, a small unit of Moroccan gendarmes landed on the island and raised the Moroccan flag. Spain responded within days by sending in special forces to retake it. No shots were fired, and no one was hurt. But for a few tense days, two NATO-aligned nations came close to a real military confrontation over a rock with no permanent resident. The crisis only ended after the United States, through Secretary of State Colin Powell, brokered a return to the pre-crisis status quo. None of these outposts have meaningful civilian populations. They exist as symbols of sovereignty and as strategic tripwires that periodically remind both governments what is actually at stake along this coastline. Together, these scattered rocks and islets form a chain of small, mostly forgotten claims stretching along hundreds of kilometers of Moroccan coastline, a quieter, less visible version of the same story playing out at Ceuta and Melilla. Ceuta's role in Spanish history is not only medieval, it played a central part in one of the 20th century's most consequential wars, and most people have no idea. By the 1930s, Spain controlled not just Ceuta and Melilla, but a much larger territory, the Spanish Protectorate of Morocco, a strip of northern Morocco under Spanish colonial administration since 1912. Spain's colonial army there, the Army of Africa, was built around elite units, the Spanish Foreign Legion and Moroccan Regulars, hardened in the very Rif campaigns that followed the disaster at Annual. In July 1936, a group of Spanish generals launched a coordinated military uprising against Spain's democratically elected Republican government. The uprising did not begin in Madrid, or Barcelona, or anywhere on the Spanish mainland. It began in Spanish Morocco, with Ceuta and Melilla among the very first cities to fall to the rebels. General Francisco Franco, then stationed in the Canary Islands, flew to Spanish Morocco to take command of the Army of Africa, the most experienced, most battle-hardened force in the entire Spanish military. That army, ferried across the Strait of Gibraltar, with help from Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, became the spearhead of the nationalist advance into mainland Spain. Historians widely regard the Army of Africa's crossing as one of the turning points of the Spanish Civil War. Without it, Franco's uprising might have stalled and failed within weeks. In other words, the same narrow strip of African coastline that gave Portugal its first colonial foothold in 1415 also gave a 20th century dictator the army that would rule Spain for the next 4 decades. Ceuta is not just an old curiosity on a map. It has repeatedly been the hinge on which much larger events turned. The civil war that followed would kill hundreds of thousands of people and end in nearly 4 decades of dictatorship. A war whose opening chapter was written not in Spain, but on this stretch of African coast. After Franco won the Civil War in 1939, Spain retained its African possessions for decades, even as the rest of Europe's colonial empires began to collapse after World War II. Morocco itself gained independence from both France and Spain in 1956, ending the protectorate system that had divided the country between the 2 European powers. France gave up its much larger share of Morocco. Spain gave up its protectorate zone too, but pointedly did not give up Ceuta and Melilla. Spain's argument, then as now, was that Ceuta and Melilla were never colonies at all. They were, in Spain's telling, integral Spanish territory, held since centuries before Morocco existed as a modern state. Newly independent Morocco disagreed immediately and has never stopped disagreeing. Through the 1960s and 1970s, as African nations across the continent gained independence and pushed decolonization at the United Nations, Morocco repeatedly raised Ceuta and Melilla as unfinished business. Spain, first under Franco, and later under its democratic governments, held firm. The 2 cities were folded ever more tightly into the Spanish state, culminating in their 1995 status as autonomous cities, with their own elected government. Spain's grip on North Africa did not end without a fight elsewhere either. In 1957, as Morocco pushed for full sovereignty over the remaining Spanish zones, an armed conflict broke out, the Ifni War. Moroccan-backed irregular forces encouraged by the newly independent Moroccan state, attacked Spanish positions in Ifni and the Spanish Sahara, further south along the Atlantic coast. Spanish troops, at times reinforced by French forces from neighboring Algeria and Mauritania, fought through the winter of 1957 into 1958 to hold the remaining African territories. The war ended with Spain ceding the Tarfaya Strip to Morocco in 1958, though it held on to Ifni until 1969, and the Spanish Sahara until 1975. Ceuta and Melilla were never seriously threatened during the Ifni War, but the conflict showed how contested Spain's African holdings had become and how far Madrid was willing to go to defend them. It also hardened Spain's determination never to negotiate away Ceuta and Melilla the way it eventually let go of Ifni and the Spanish Sahara. That is the paradox sitting underneath this entire story. In an era when Europe was giving up its African empires, Spain kept 2 cities on the African mainland, and has held on to them for another 70 years since. There is one more chapter worth pausing on, because it shows just how much strategic weight this small stretch of coastline has carried, even when Spain itself stayed out of a war. Franco kept Spain formally neutral throughout the Second World War, but that neutrality was never entirely passive, especially around the Strait of Gibraltar. Nazi Germany drew up plans, codenamed Operation Felix, to seize British Gibraltar with Spanish cooperation, using Spanish territory, including areas near Ceuta, as a staging ground. Franco ultimately declined to join the Axis war effort outright, wary of British naval power and the risk of losing Spain's remaining African territories in the process. Even so, Allied planners treated the Strait of Gibraltar as a permanent vulnerability. The 1942 Allied invasion of North Africa, Operation Torch, was planned with an eye on exactly this chokepoint. Historians still debate how close Spain came to entering the war on the Axis side, but Ceuta's position at the mouth of the strait was central to that calculation on both sides. Once again, a city most people had never heard of found itself sitting at the center of decisions being made in Berlin, London, and Washington. Here is the strategic core of this entire story. Ceuta and Melilla sit directly on the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow gateway between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. Together with British-controlled Gibraltar on the opposite shore, they form what geostrategists sometimes call the keys of the Mediterranean. Whoever controls this strait has influence over one of the busiest maritime choke points on the planet. Enormous volumes of trade pass through here every year. Container ships, oil tankers, and energy shipments moving between Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas. A hostile power controlling both shores of this strait could, in theory, choke off Mediterranean shipping almost entirely, cutting Europe's southern trade lifeline. Analysts commonly rank the Strait of Gibraltar among the handful of maritime choke points, alongside the Strait of Hormuz and the Suez Canal, whose closure could meaningfully disrupt global trade. That is not a hypothetical concern for military planners. NATO's naval doctrine has treated the strait as a critical strategic passage since the alliance's founding in 1949. For Spain and for NATO, holding Ceuta and Melilla is not a colonial relic. It is a live strategic asset. It is the southern anchor of European defense on the African continent, the only piece of NATO territory that sits, geographically, in Africa itself. Now here's where the story gets diplomatically uncomfortable for Spain. Just across the strait sits Gibraltar, a small territory controlled by Britain since 1713, ceded by Spain itself under the Treaty of Utrecht that ended the War of the Spanish Succession. Spain has spent 3 centuries demanding that Gibraltar be returned, calling it a colonial anomaly on Spanish soil. Spain argues that geography and history entitle it to Gibraltar, regardless of what the roughly 32,000 current residents want, residents who have voted overwhelmingly in referendums to remain British. Gibraltarians voted to stay British in referendums held in 1967 and again in 2002 by margins of well over 98% on each occasion. Spain does not accept that these votes should settle the matter, arguing sovereignty is a question between states, not a matter of local preference. The same argument Morocco makes about Ceuta and Melilla. But Morocco makes the exact same argument about Ceuta and Melilla, claiming they are colonial holdovers on African soil that rightfully belong to Morocco, regardless of what current residents prefer. Morocco has never recognized Spanish sovereignty over either city. Officially, Rabat considers them occupied Moroccan territory, and Moroccan school textbooks reportedly depict them as such. So Spain finds itself using one argument to claim Gibraltar from Britain, while rejecting the very same argument when Morocco uses it against Ceuta and Melilla. It is one of the more striking contradictions in modern European diplomacy, a mirror image dispute, with Spain standing on opposite sides of the exact same logic, one strait apart. Because Ceuta and Melilla are physically in Africa, they have become something else entirely since Spain joined the European Community in 1986, the only land borders between the European Union and the African continent. When Spain joined the Schengen area in the 1990s, agreeing to open its borders with the rest of Europe, it had to do the opposite in Africa, fortifying Ceuta and Melilla to keep the EU's external frontier under control. For migrants trying to reach Europe without crossing the open sea, these two cities became the closest thing to a walkable door into the EU app. Spain built tall, heavily fortified border fences around both cities in response, multiple layers of steel, topped with anti-climbing mesh, backed by motion sensors and constant patrols. But the fences created a strange dynamic. Whenever Morocco chooses to loosen its side of border enforcement, even briefly, large numbers of people can cross almost immediately. That gives Morocco an unusual lever of pressure over Madrid, a lever that has been pulled more than once, and one no conventional military ever provided. The 2021 and 2026 crises were not the first time this fence became the story. In the autumn of 2005, coordinated groups of sub-Saharan migrants staged mass attempts to storm the Ceuta and Melilla fences using homemade ladders. Spanish and Moroccan security forces responded with force on both sides of the border. Multiple migrants died in the crush and in the response, drawing international condemnation and scrutiny. The 2005 crisis was a turning point for the physical border itself. It triggered EU funding and pressure that led Spain to raise, reinforce, and modernize the fences into the multi-layered barriers seen today. In other words, every generation of fence upgrade at Ceuta has followed a crisis, and every crisis has followed a lull in enforcement that made the fence, however tall, feel temporarily beatable. In May 2021, Morocco dramatically eased its border controls near Ceuta. Within about 48 hours, more than 8,000 migrants swam or climbed across into Spanish territory, including roughly 1,500 unaccompanied minors, according to Spain's then Interior Minister. Spain called it a national crisis and deployed the army to the border, with armored vehicles guarding Ceuta's beaches. The timing was not a coincidence. Spain had just allowed the leader of the Polisario Front, a Western Sahara independence movement Morocco strongly opposes, to receive hospital treatment on Spanish soil under a false identity. Spanish officials directly accused Morocco of using migration as a tool of political retaliation, a form of pressure some called blackmail. 2 years later, Spain shifted its historic neutral position on Western Sahara, moving closer to Morocco's position that the territory should have autonomy under Moroccan sovereignty rather than full independence. Many analysts saw a direct line between the 2021 border crisis and that policy shift, even though Spanish officials publicly insisted the two issues were unrelated. The 2021 crisis also strained relations between Spain and the rest of the EU, as other member states questioned why Spain's bilateral dispute with Morocco was being resolved on a shared European frontier. The lesson Rabat may have learned: opening the fence, even for a few hours, can move Spanish foreign policy in ways that years of quiet diplomacy cannot. Which brings us back to this week. On Thursday, July 30th, 2026, the scale of crossings into Ceuta reached levels far beyond even 2021. Spain's Interior Ministry initially estimated that around 49,000 people crossed in a single 24-hour period. Other estimates from local officials ran even higher, up to 60,000. Ceuta's regional president, Juan Jesus Vives, said the wave of new arrivals was equivalent, in proportion to the city's population, to roughly 1 million people entering the whole of Spain at once. The confirmed death toll started at 18. Within a day, some outlets were reporting figures above 30, and later reports cited tolls as high as the mid-50s or higher, as more bodies were recovered along the coastline. The exact final toll remains genuinely uncertain, a reminder of how chaotic and undocumented an event like this actually is on the ground. Videos showed burned vehicles on the Moroccan side of the border, explosions and clashes between migrants and Moroccan security forces. Crossings were also attempted at Melilla, though the surge there was smaller and appeared to be driven by the chaos unfolding in Ceuta rather than a separate cause. By Friday afternoon, Spanish authorities said more than 48,000 of those who had crossed had already been returned to Morocco, though thousands reportedly remained in the city. Analysts pointed to a mix of causes behind the surge: economic hardship inside Morocco, misinformation circulating online about migrants being allowed to stay, and the organized activity of trafficking networks profiting from the chaos. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez traveled to Ceuta personally on Friday, calling the mass crossing a violation of Spain's territorial integrity. Spain deployed additional police and military personnel to the border and began attempting rapid returns of migrants to Morocco. That effort is complicated by a recent ruling from Spain's Supreme Court limiting the return of migrants who arrive by sea. An added legal constraint the 2021 crisis did not involve in the same way. Ceuta's government requested that Madrid formally declare a national emergency. The central government declined, arguing migration surges do not fall within the legal framework that governs such declarations. The crisis quickly became a European story, not just a Spanish one. Italy's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, publicly floated the idea of extraordinary EU-level measures in response to the scale of the surge. Coverage inside Spain captured how differently the same event could be read on the ground. Some residents described an invasion, aid workers described a humanitarian emergency, and local officials found themselves managing both realities at once. That split reaction, security threat to some, humanitarian catastrophe to others, is itself part of why Ceuta keeps resurfacing as a symbol far larger than its size would suggest. Strip away the immediate headlines, and a pattern becomes clear. Ceuta and Melilla occupy a geography that makes them permanently vulnerable. European territory, reachable only through African cooperation. As long as Morocco controls the flow on its side of the fence, it holds informal leverage over Spanish, and by extension European, migration policy. Every surge, 2021 and now 2026, has followed a moment of political friction, economic strain, or shifting incentives between Rabat and Madrid. Whether or not each crisis is a deliberate signal from the Moroccan state, the pattern gives Morocco a form of leverage no conventional military base ever could. And every time it happens, Spain is forced to confront the same uncomfortable truth. It holds two cities on foreign soil that it cannot fully defend without the cooperation of its neighbor. This is the same underlying vulnerability that has shaped Ceuta's story since 1415. A European toehold on African land, permanently dependent on the goodwill or the calculations of whoever controls the surrounding territory. 600 years of Portuguese conquest, Iberian treaties, colonial protectorates, and civil war have all, in their own way, circled back to this single fact. It is a pattern visible at other borders too. Wherever a wealthy territory sits physically inside, or attached to, a much poorer or less stable neighbor, that border tends to become a pressure point sooner or later. What makes Ceuta and Melilla distinctive is how long this particular pressure point has existed, and how many unrelated historical forces, empire, treaty, war, and now migration, have all passed through the same narrow gate. Ceuta was born from a 15th century conquest, preserved by a 17th century treaty, weaponized by a 20th century general, and is now a 21st century flashpoint. It is a place where medieval history, Cold War-style geopolitics, and modern migration collide on a single stretch of fence. Spain calls it sovereign territory. Morocco calls it occupied land. Migrants call it the closest door to Europe. All three descriptions are true at the same time, and that contradiction is exactly why Ceuta keeps making headlines 6 centuries after Portuguese ships first landed there. From the Marinette port that Portugal conquered in 1415, through the treaty that made it Spanish in 1668, through the disaster at Annual, and the army that marched on Madrid in 1936, to defenses of 2026. One thread runs unbroken. Ceuta has never simply belonged to the place it sits in. It has always belonged to whoever could hold it, and that is precisely what keeps it contested today. As long as that contradiction remains unresolved, this will not be the last time the world watches this small stretch of African coastline become a battleground for something much larger than itself.